What's going on, baseheads? In this video, I'm going to show y'all how to plan out building a car audio system. That way it'll save you time and money and the frustration. You don't have to go down the rabbit hole of trying one thing and then another thing and another thing. So I'm going to show you two main ways so you can plan it out. That way you can ensure that you've got a system that you want. All right, now when planning out your system, one main key you need to know is how much power you want to run. That's gonna determine if you need to get a bigger alternator and battery or stick to your stock alternator. If you are staying in like the 1,000-watt range, 1,200-watt range, you can get away with a stock alternator and stock electrical. Maybe just do a big 3 and possibly a second battery. But that's where it all starts, is with your electrical. So I'm gonna lay out two different scenarios for you here. First scenario, you just want a 1,000-watt amp with two cheaper 12s. Knowing that you're only gonna run a 1,000-watt amp, if your stock alternator is at least 100 amps or 120 amps, that should be fine. So you won't have to upgrade the electrical. But one thing you want to do is pick a good amp, a nice efficient amp, and some efficient subwoofers. That way you don't have to pull a lot of amperage to get the watts that you're looking for. So stock electrical, maybe do your big 3 and possibly a second battery in the trunk. And then you're going to go ahead and get your amp, find the amp that you're looking for. It's always good to have a little headroom. So if you're looking for 1,000 watts, maybe get a 2,000 watt amp or a 1,500 watt amp, a true 1,500 watt amp. That way you have a little headroom. You don't have to worry about clipping or distortion, and you know you have nice clean power. Whenever you start distorting or clipping, that's going to draw way more power. You can have 1,000 watts of clean power and holding a voltage at 14.2, or you can have 1,000 watts of distorted power and it's dropping down to low 12 volt range. I've done it on the same alternator, same setup. I've had around 1,400 watts that was killing the voltage, and then I swapped out them amps for a good efficient amp. It was actually a Tear Amps Smart Base 5K, and I went from being able to put 1,400 watts RMS to it to 2,300 watts RMS, dropping down to the same voltage. So your amp definitely does matter. A more efficient amp is going to be more expensive, but in the long run, it's going to be way better and it's going to be louder. So second scenario, if you already know that you want to run over 1,500 watts, you're going to want to go ahead and get an alternator and possibly a battery. So say you're planning on running two 3,000 watt amps, two Tear Amps 3,000s, 3Ks, 6,000 watts. Even if you're planning on just running around 3,000 watts of clean power, to run 3,000 watts, you're definitely going to need a bigger alternator. I'm running a 370 amp alternator and a small battery bank. Everybody runs lithium. Lithium can put out a ton of power and hold voltage really well. So when you're planning on a system like this, go ahead and figure out which alternator you want to run. Typically the biggest alternator that you can get for that vehicle, and a small battery bank. Now of course, when building these, you should go ahead and do your head unit and your components first before you worry about the base. But if you're not worried about that, then go alternator, amp, subs. So now that you have your high output alternator and your battery bank, go ahead and choose what amps you want to run, get all your wiring, and then from there, do your subs in your box. Now what this is going to do is keep you from, say you go get a 5,000 watt amp and two large subs or 4 subs, and you think you're going to run that off your electrical, and come to find out you can only put about 800 or 900 watts to it. And then you have to go back and get an alternator and a battery and all that. Or in this scenario over here, you've got a stock alternator, you don't plan on upgrading that, and you go and get a Tear Amps 3,000 watt amp or a 5,000 watt amp, and you get two ZVX 15s and then realize you can't even turn the amp halfway up. So now you have to backtrack and either go upgrade all your electrical, or you got to get rid of that whole system and get something more efficient. So low power, just make sure you have a good efficient amp and subs, but just know you're not going to go over 1500 watts RMS at the max, and that's if you have a really good stock alternator like a 180 amp or something like that. And if you're already planning on doing more than that, go ahead and do your electrical and then your system, and you'll be in there. Another thing to keep in mind when you're designing your system is your box space. Whatever trunk room you have or SUV, you want to make sure you're going to be able to build the proper enclosure, the proper size that you need for the subs that you plan on running. You might have to go a little bit smaller. Maybe you realize you wanted 15s, but you don't have the room for them. So you could go down to the same model subs, but 12s. And as long as you have the proper power and everything to run to it, it'll sound great. The 12s on the proper power is gonna hit harder than the same subs, but 15s in the wrong box on dirty power. So just keep that in mind when planning this out. So I've been down this road before. I've wasted a lot of money and time to get to where I'm at, and I still need a battery bank. So I'm waiting to get the money for the lithium now. But when I started out, my town car had a 130 amp alternator stock, and I'd got a SCAR 1500 watt RP amp, which was a horrible amp. It distorted at around 700 watts and dropped the voltage like crazy. So then I realized I needed to do something with the electrical. I got a 240 amp alternator, thinking that was gonna run a pretty big system. In reality, I did not have the battery reserve to run what I was hoping for. So I had two SCAR RP 1500s, which were only clamping around 1450 watts, and it couldn't even, that 240 couldn't even keep up with it. So after that, it was kind of a cheap 240 amp alternator, so I scratched that, went to Autotech and got a 370 amp car audio alternator. Was for sure that was going to handle the power. Still distorted. Voltage dropped like crazy, would drop down to high 11s. And so at that point, I figured maybe it's the amps. Maybe the amps are just bad. So I had got a SoundCube 8K, and I was able to put a lot more power on it with that amp. Just having that headroom and being more efficient and knowing I can get clean power, no problem. Being an 8K, I was putting 2,000 to it clean all day. Sounded great. But in my mind, I didn't realize you still had to have such a reserve or a battery bank. I figured 370 amp alternator, I can probably push 3,000 watts RMS to it. Didn't really work out that way. Right now I'm running the Teramp Smart Base 5K on a 370 amp alternator with two AGM batteries, and I can still only clamp around 2200, 2300, and it drops to high 11s. So once I get a small lithium bank, I'm going to do a 40 amp hour Yinglong excess power bank. Once I do that, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to max out that amp. I should be able to get around 4,000 watts RMS. That's with a 370 amp and a small battery bank. So make sure you know what equipment you want before you start. That way it saves you a bunch of money and you don't end up in the hole or losing money. Alright, that's all I got for this one. I appreciate y'all watching. Stay tuned for more videos, and I'm out. Peace.